It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Sheldon Solomon. Dr. Solomon is a professor of psychology at Skidmore College. He is the author of a number of books, co-author of In the Wake of 9/11, Psychology of Terror, and most recently, The Worm at the Core, The Role of Death in Life, which, by the way, is on sale in the lobby if you'd want to pick up a copy, and if we have some time, Dr. Solomon said he would be happy to sign a copy or two. He is the co-creator of terror management theory, and you'll hear more about that, which is a social psychological perspective on the works of Ernest Becker. He's also the author of over 100 articles, and he's won a number of awards for his science and his education work. Personally, I think of Sheldon as one of the much needed public intellectuals. I can't stress that enough. And also, I consider him to be the personification of the contemporary heroism that our organization is about. Go ahead, blush. Please welcome Sheldon Solomon.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you so much for being here this evening. You all look vaguely familiar, but I know that I don't know everybody. And for those of you that I do know, it's good to see you all. And for those of you that are joining us for the first time, welcome. And I hope that this will be an interesting and provocative evening. I want to talk about the 2016 election, which I'm told is quite animated. And I say that because I've been traveling a lot throughout the summer. I've been abroad and been on the West Coast, East Coast, been in Canada, and there's a considerable interest, and I think it's safe to say that a lot of the interest has to do with the fact that for the first time, perhaps in American politics, we have a very special candidate, regardless of one's opinion of him. He's only the second person in American history to run for top office without any prior experience in terms of holding office. We'll talk about the other guy in a little while. And I guess what I'd like to do is to just start by noting, what I want to do actually is to start by telling you to check your political preferences at the door, at least for the moment. I'm going to assume that many of you have strong opinions one way or the other, and I do also, but this isn't about politics right now so much as I want to make an argument based on actual evidence, and I'm going to show you some experiments. We're actually going to have to do some work, those of you that don't have a background in experimental psychology, but I know you can do it. All right, so let's get to the election. There are a variety of opinions about Mr. Trump, and they tend to be rather polarized. There's not much of a continuum. On the one side of things is the notion of Trump as a monstrous clown. And I didn't make that up. That comes from the great Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David McCullough. Has anybody seen the Facebook page of Historians Against Trump? Maybe, maybe not, but he coined that phrase, and I kind of like that. Old timers, do you remember Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein? Anybody remember that film? Even the youth. And when I saw Monstrous Clown, I was like, wow, I pictured Gene Wilder in the lab with a big beaker. It's like, oh, let's get one part Hitler, one part Rodney Dangerfield from Caddyshack, one part Eric Cartman from South Park, maybe a little dash of Crazy Eddie, those of you that remember that from the old days, and then just put a fistful of last year's candy corn from Halloween, and then hit spin. And when you get done, just flash a bolt of lightning, and there's Donald Trump. And I say this from the point of view of his detractors, that most would say, well, here's a vulgar, sadistic, vindictive, egomaniacal, misogynistic, racist, xenophobic, twittering Mussolini cheese doodle impersonator. And if you say, wow, that's kind of harsh, they would go on to say, yes, and moreover, this is someone grotesquely ignorant, who makes no pretense of being coherent, consistent, or even to make contact with what's true, and by virtue of all those things is unfit for public office. I want to emphasize that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that's what his detractors would say. On the other hand, there's other folks that they love Mr. Trump. They see him as a heroic change agent, a savvy deal-making businessman who is unrestrained by political correctness, unbeholden to special interests, and they're enthralled by his pledge to make America great again, by revitalizing the economy, by building a giant wall to secure the southern border, by deporting 11 million undocumented immigrants, and by bombing the shit out of ISIS. And my goal for today is to add yet another idea, of which there is no shortage, of both pundits and academics who have attempted to explain why it is that Mr. Trump has done so well politically and why he's such a polarizing figure. And we don't have time. It would take hours, if not days, to go through all of the existing psychological, sociological, economic arguments about Mr. Trump's success. And I think they're all useful, but I want to add one more. And I want to use the ideas of Ernest Becker, as you'll see momentarily. I want to claim that unconscious death anxiety is a very real and a very potent explanation for political preferences. And I want to argue that for the most part, these phenomena occur quite unconsciously. All right, so my buddies and I, we work under the rubric of what we call terror management theory, but that's really just our efforts to take Ernest Becker's ideas, particularly as he expressed them in the 1974 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, and to render them testable. So Ernest Becker in 1974, in The Denial of Death, he just said, following Alexander Smith, it is our knowledge that we have to die that makes us human. And Becker's book is really just an evolutionary and existential psychodynamic elaboration of this basic idea, and I hope I'm not the first one to alert you of the reality of the human condition, that you, like all living things, are of finite duration. What Becker does is to say that single idea can explain a significant proportion of everything that we do and everything that we think about, whether we're aware of it or not. And very simply, in a nutshell, and some of you are very much familiar with these ideas already, Becker just starts with the Darwinian assumption that people, in some ways, are like all other creatures. We share a basic biological predisposition towards self-preservation in the interests of survival and reproduction, but what makes us unique is we've got this ginormous forebrain. And this allows us to do a lot of things, including think abstractly and symbolically, to the point where we're literally able to create things that don't even exist, or to think about them and then actually create them. We can think about things that have happened in the past, even before we've ever been here. We can think about things that might happen in the very distant future, and we can imagine ourselves in an infinite number of potential or possible scenarios. And what Becker does is to borrow ideas from the Danish existential philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who pointed out in the 1840s that people are so smart that we actually realize that we exist. And if the lights were a little bit brighter, I would annoy you, and I'd say, oh, who's aware of the fact that you're sitting here now listening to me or pretending to do so? And I would hope I could get a considerable number of hands. At Skidmore, 50%, and I'm doing pretty well. Just saying. All right, but anyway, the point is that Kierkegaard said, you know what? Humans are so smart that we actually realize that we exist. And the point that Kierkegaard made in his own turgid language is that it takes a ridiculously sophisticated cognitive apparatus to render yourself the object of your own subjective inquiry. Right? English translation, a rose bush is here but doesn't know it. An armadillo's here but doesn't know it. You're here and you know it. And according to Becker and Kierkegaard, if you're smart enough to know that you're here, that's both awesome and dreadful. Right? It's awesome to be alive and know it because that's what makes it great to be a human being. Who's ever had a great day? I hope you've all had one. Today was a particularly good one, where you wake up and nothing big happened. You didn't win the lottery or a Nobel Prize or an Olympic medal. You're just like, yeah, fucking A, life is great, life is good. All right, well, I hope, hold that thought. I grew up in New Jersey. It didn't happen that often, but it is awesome to be alive and know it, but it's also dreadful. And the point that Becker makes, and here he's following in a long tradition of other existential thinkers, is that if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you necessarily realize that you will someday die, that you could die at any time for reasons that you could never anticipate or control, or that from a purely biological point of view, you're no fundamentally more significant or enduring than a lizard or a potato. And what Becker argues is that if that was the only thing that we thought about, I'm gonna die someday, I can walk outside and get smote by a meteor. I'm a breathing piece of defecating meat. I'm a cold cut with an attitude. I'm spam with a plan, but I've got no can. Diego, that was for you. And I got a lot more, but I won't bore you with my sophomoric New Jersey humor. But the point is that you wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning if that's all you thought about. And thankfully, according to Becker, what our ancestors did, rather ingeniously, albeit quite unconsciously, is to solve the problem of how to manage the existential terror that is engendered by the awareness of death, which is in turn an unanticipated byproduct of our vast intelligence through the construction and maintenance of what the anthropologists call culture. Humanly constructed beliefs about the nature of reality that we share with other people that minimizes death anxiety by giving us each a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. All cultures provide an account of the origin of the universe. All cultures have prescriptions for how we should behave while we're here. All cultures have some hope of immortality, either literally through the heavens, souls, reincarnations, and afterlives of the world's great religions, or symbolically, you may realize that you won't be here forever, but you're still comforted by the possibility that a vestige of your existence will persist over time, perhaps by having children, by amassing great fortunes, by writing great books, or maybe making great works of art or scientific discoveries. Right, well, that's pretty much what Ernest Becker says in a proverbial nutshell. We are so smart that we learn that we're here. That's uplifting, but it's also terrifying. In order to manage existential terror, what we do is to embed ourselves. Actually, it happens quite before we're even aware of the fact that we exist, but we embrace cultural worldviews that provide us with a sense that life has meaning and we have value. Well, the question then arises, though. Becker won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Denial of Death, in 1974, but he was basically mocked. People said, well, that's just bullshit. That's speculative, or a lot of people did, at least academic psychologists just said, wow, this is taken from psychoanalysis, existential philosophy. These are interesting ideas, but how do we know that they're true? And so here's where my buddies and I come in, starting in the early 1980s. And I know it's late, and many of you, it's not late yet, but you've had a big day at work. And so this is the densest part of what we need to do today, is to make believe we're in an experimental psychology class. And I need to introduce two experimental paradigms. One's what's called the mortality salience paradigm. And this is very simple. What we do is we remind some people that they're going to die. One way that we do it is by asking these questions. Please briefly describe the emotions that the thought of your own death arouse in you. and jot down as specifically what you think will happen to you as you physically die, as specifically as you can. Right? In control conditions, we ask people to think of something negative but not fatal. Imagine having an exam if you're a student. Imagine being in pain. You're at the dentist and you need a root canal. Imagine being in a car accident. You have a limb lopped off. Imagine giving a talk in public and projectile vomiting onto the audience, engendering an extraordinarily negative response that you're not all that happy about. Excuse me. Right. But we make people aware of their mortality in other ways also. Sometimes we give them death anxiety scales. Sometimes they watch videos of gory automobile accidents. Anybody back in the day know the Faces of Death documentary? For those of you that have a morbid sense of humor, sometimes we watch them. We show them pictures of electrocutions and autopsies. Sometimes we do studies outside of the lab. We stop people in front of a funeral parlor or 100 meters to either side. And then sometimes we do it really, this is like Star Wars. We bring them into the lab and we have them read something. And unbeknownst to them, we flash the word dead or death for 28 milliseconds so fast that you don't even know that you've seen it. All right, all of these different ways of making people aware that they will someday die turn out to produce the same effects. All right, so what do we know very, very quickly? I'm going to just bounce through this to give you a flavor of some of the previous findings. When municipal court judges are reminded of the fact that they die, they set a 9 times higher bond for an alleged prostitute. Right? When Christians are reminded that they will someday die, they love fellow Christians and they hate Jewish people. When Israelis are reminded that they will someday die, they love Jewish people and they hate Christians and Arabs. When Germans are reminded that they will someday die, they sit closer to Germans and they sit further away from people who appear to be Turkish immigrants. When Iranians are reminded that they're going to die, they become more supportive of suicide bombing, and they become more willing to become a suicide bomber. I hope that makes you as uncomfortable as I. Americans, as you know, are quite pragmatic. We're not about to blow ourselves up, but we're happy to blow up other people. So when we remind Americans that they're going to die, that increases their support for the use of nuclear, chemical, biological weapons of mass destruction against countries who pose no direct threat to us. The take-home message here is very simply that there's a boatload of evidence. There's actually more than 1,000 studies now that show that when you remind people of their mortality, it influences just about everything in the service of bolstering confidence in our cultural worldview and maintaining a sense that we're persons of value in the context of it. All right, now, that was paradigm number 1. I'm going to call that mortality salience paradigm. All right, paradigm number 2 is called death thought accessibility. Let's forget about self-esteem for tonight, and let's just say if cultural worldviews reduce existential terror, then if your worldview is somehow threatened, that should make thoughts of death come more readily to mind. All right, a couple of head shakes for an emotional boost for me, if that makes some sense. All right, this is a little sticky, but I need you to work with me, and you're doing great. All right, so the way that we usually measure death thought accessibility, there's other ways to do it, but we're just going to talk about one. We use what's called a word stem completion task. People come in, we give them about 20 things, and we're like, make a word out of that. All right, well, if you've just passed a Starbucks, whether you remember it or not, you're likely to say coffee. If you've just passed a cemetery, you're more likely to say coffin. All right, same thing with this one. If you've just passed a builder or a carpenter, you might say skill. If you've just passed a mortuary, you're more likely to say skull. All right, and we know this works because if we blast subliminal death primes into people's heads, and then we have them do 20 of these, where 8 or 10 of them can be completed with death-related words, we find that they complete more words that have deadly connotations. All right, so just to give you an example of experiments, Christian fundamentalists who are shown passages in the Bible that are logically inconsistent, they have higher death thought accessibility. Right? So the argument here is that when a Christian fundamentalist worldview is being challenged, that makes death thoughts come more readily to mind. Right? And then Canadians, I thought this was funny, who read an essay belittling Canadian culture, had increased death thought accessibility also. All right, so Canadians shown a fake article referring to them as beer-guzzling, hockey puck-loving people. That also made death thought accessibility come more readily to mind. All right, so here's the big point. We got to just note it, and we'll come back to it. And that is that when death thought accessibility is increased, that produces the same effects as when we remind people of their mortality. I know this was deadly, a non-pharmacological intervention for insomnia, but hold these thoughts, and now let's get to the point. Let's talk about charismatic leaders and followers. Max Weber, the great German sociologist at the beginning of the 20th century, he said that at times of historical crisis, that people are likely to embrace a certain kind of leader. Who's heard the term charismatic leader before? Right. Well, you wouldn't have before Weber. He was the guy who coined the term, and he described a charismatic leader as a seemingly larger-than-life individual who is often believed to be divinely ordained to rid the world of evil. Weber's tough, so I'm going to read, and just read with me if you can see this. This is from Jean Littman Blumen, a woman who I like. She's the co-founder of the Peter Drucker Institute. And she says, charismatic leaders have a way of appearing in times of great distress. They usually espouse a decidedly radical vision that promises to resolve the crisis. Crisis, by definition, is a period of great threat and uncertainty, a time when the existing leadership seems to falter. It is also a period in which the society's ordinary coping mechanisms are out of kilter. It is not then at all that surprising that a charismatic leader offering a solution, however radical, is particularly welcome in difficult times. Of course, one might even argue that in the turmoil and anxiety that keep company with crisis, anyone who confidently promises a solution is likely to be looked upon as charismatic. Followers' response to charismatic is a devotion born of distress. How's that sound? Does that make sense? All right, so the question is, well, is this true? This is a theoretical assertion about what underlies our attraction to charismatic leaders. And so we did a study. This was done in 2002 or 3 when I was working at Brooklyn College. I was on the PhD faculty in experimental psychology based in Brooklyn College. And we did a very simple experiment. We got a bunch of students. We reminded half of them of death. We reminded the other half of them about an upcoming exam. And then we gave them 3 little contrived campaign statements by hypothetical gubernatorial candidates. And they varied in leadership style. We had a charismatic leader. We had what's called a task-oriented leader. That's just somebody that says, I know how to get stuff done. And then we had a relationship-oriented leader. And this is somebody who says, no, I can't do it alone. We've got to work together. And these leadership types we got from the leadership literature. All right, so just to give you an example of some of the phrases from the speeches, the charismatic leader said, amongst other things, you're not just an ordinary citizen, you are part of a special, how about great, and a state, and a special, how about great, nation. Task-oriented leader, I can accomplish all the goals that I set out to do. I'm very careful in laying out a detailed blueprint of what needs to be done so there's no ambiguity. Relationship-oriented leader, I encourage all citizens to take an active role in improving their state. I know that each individual can make a difference. All right, so next up, they read all 3 statements. For those of you that remember methods in experimental psych, the order of the statements was counterbalanced to ensure that the order of presentation didn't matter. And then we just said, hey, who would you vote for? All right, so the question is, how do each of these different kind of leaders do in a mock election, depending upon whether or not they've been reminded of their mortality? All right, so I don't know if you could see these numbers. So In the top row here is the control condition, and this number is 4. The charismatic leader gets 4 out of 100 votes when people are in a psychologically benign state of mind. Head shakes if you understand how paltry that is. That's like you're having an election for what to have for school lunch, and here's 43 votes for pizza, 48 for hamburger, 4 votes for refried cat's assholes with cheese. So the charismatic leader is not particularly favored under control conditions. But look what happens when death is on people's minds. Now the charismatic leader gets almost 8 times the number of votes. So what? This is just a bogus gubernatorial election. Let's see what happens in reality. I know most of you were New Yorkers, who was in Manhattan on September 11th, 2001. I was actually at the World Trade Center, sort of, but a lot of us were downtown that day. And I was working again at Brooklyn College with a very talented student, Florette Cohen, who's now a professor at the College of Staten Island. And she came in on September 12th, and we were working together. She was actually doing an independent study on Ernest Becker, and she was interested in the rise of charismatic leaders. She was actually particularly interested in Hitler's rise to power in Germany. The point, though, is that President Bush arguably became a charismatic leader as a result of the events of September 11th. You guys know how to read, and I'm just going to blow through this very, very quickly, but don't take my word for it. Go look at the front page of the New York Times on Sunday, September 9th, where Bush has basically been declared a lame duck. I'm not going to read this. I'm just saying that he had one of the lowest approval ratings in the history of presidential polling. And yet, 3 weeks later, who remembers this? President Bush had one of the highest approval ratings in the history of presidential polling among Democrats as well as Republicans, after he said on September 17th, this is a new kind of evil. We will rid the world of the evildoers. On October 22nd, on the cover story of Time magazine, President Bush said that he is buoyed by his faith that God has chosen him to lead the country during this perilous time. Well, Florette's like, wow, I'm not trying to be cynical, but September 11th was the best thing that could have happened to President Bush politically. Because our argument, and we wrote a book called In the Wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror, is that the events of September 11th were like a giant death reminder, right? There was the literal death and carnage and all of the people that terribly perished that day. And then there was the symbolic assault on the American way of life, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, just powerful symbols of American military and economic might. All right, so we said, okay, let's see what's up. I mean, what happened in 3 weeks? You know, did President Bush just magically metamorphosize from a functionally illiterate oil industry neocon meat puppet into an effective public servant? Maybe. On the other hand, maybe what happened is that Americans' existential anxieties, quite unbeknownst to them, altered their impressions of the president. All right, first study, very simple, if I could get it to work. I'm going. Oh, there it is. Okay, so first study, very simple. 2 groups, 1 group is reminded, so now these slides don't work out too well, but I'll point things out, and then I'll give you a way to get direct access to readable pieces of information by the time I finish today. But we reminded some people of death, we reminded some other people of unpleasant stuff. When people, in this case, these were students reminded of an upcoming exam, they didn't like President Bush all that much, and they didn't agree with his policies in Iraq. Right, on the other hand, here's what happened when they were reminded of death first. Right, that's the first study. Right, the second study, now John Kerry is the Democratic challenger, so we do the same study again. We remind some people of death, We remind other people, in this case, of being in pain, and then we ask them to either evaluate Senator Kerry or President Bush. In this case, Bush is in red. No, Bush is in green, and Kerry is in red, and this is the control condition. And can you see that Senator Kerry is much more highly regarded than President Bush? Head shakes, can you see that? All right, but look what happens over here when they were reminded of death. Now their impression of Senator Kerry declines, and their impression of President Bush goes up. All right, so one more study. 5 weeks before the 2004 election, we go to Rutgers University. We stopped people on the campus who were registered voters who said they intended to vote. We reminded some people of their mortality. Other people, we asked them to think about being in pain. And then we just said, who are you going to vote for? Secret ballot, put a piece of paper in a box. All right, what we found, I still cannot believe, except that we've replicated it several times. Look what happens. Can you read this number? Eye test. All right, that's an 8. All right, so in the control condition, Senator Kerry gets 35 votes, and President Bush gets 8 votes. That's 4-1 in favor of John Kerry. All right, but look what happens when people are reminded of death first. Now Bush gets 32 votes, and Senator Kerry gets 14. Now, head shakes if that discombobulates you as much as it does I. All right, because, let me see if I've got a point here. Oh, no, we'll come back to this later. All right, so the point that I want to make is that we argued in 2004 that existential anxieties had a profound effect on the outcome of that election. Who remembers that 4 days before the election that Senator Kerry was ahead? That was before the Osama bin Laden tape came out. Does anybody remember that? And our argument is that it could have gone either way, and we thought that was a good enough death prompt to nudge people in President Bush's direction. All right, so let's fast forward to now. If I can get this to work, fast forward to now. Okay, so what I want to argue is that the 2016 election is very similar in terms of historical circumstances and in terms of the nature of Mr. Trump as a charismatic candidate. All right, we don't have another 9/11, but remember the economy's been uncertain. There were the terrorist attacks in France, in Belgium, in San Bernardino, in Orlando. There were all of the Syrian immigrants and immigrants from the Middle East fanning out into Europe. And there was a pervasive feeling on the part of many Americans that things were not going well. Right? So enter Mr. Trump, who says, wow, I'm going to take care of things. In fact, I am the only one who can make America great. All right, let's talk a little bit about one of my favorite books. Has anybody read The True Believer by Eric Hoffer? Old timers, anybody know that book? Read this book if you don't do anything else in the next X number of minutes. It's a good book. And he says 6 things that I just want to point out very quickly. All right, thing number 1, he says, is that the primary impetus for populist movements, that's what he called Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini. He said, well, what happens is you need a critical mass of frustrated and disaffected citizens, and I quote, in desperate need of something to live for. And then he says that these kinds of citizens are not unintelligent necessarily, but they're prone by virtue of their disaffection to unwavering dedication to a leader who confidently espouses a cause that, according to Hoffer, gives their lives a sense of worth and meaning. And then he says that it gives them also faith in the future via identification, the process by which the individual ceases to be himself and becomes part of something eternal. All right, but now here's the thing. And then Hoffer says, okay, but so these are the condition of the followers. Now what about the leader of a populist movement? And here I think what he says is quite astonishing. He says, look, Charismatic leaders don't need to be exceptionally intelligent, they don't need to be particularly noble, and they don't need to be original. So what do they need? And he says the primary qualifications, quote, work with me, seem to be audacity and a joy in defiance, an iron will, a fanatical conviction that he is in possession of the one and only truth, faith in his destiny and luck, a capacity for passionate hatred, contempt for the present, a cunning estimate of human nature, a delight in symbols, the arrogant gesture, the complete disregard of the opinion of others, the single-handed defiance of the world, and some deliberate misrepresentation of fact. Remember, this guy is dead. He's not Mr. Trump's biographer. And all I would argue is that, you just have to change one word, sum to total. And this really captures what I would argue is happening. All right, and then he also says, no disrespect, that's just a typical photo, but that mass movements also require an external enemy, sometimes more than one enemy, that you can declare the all-encompassing repository of evil because you need some way to channel the rage and righteous indignation of the frustrated and disaffected. So you need a tangible scapegoat that can serve as a lightning rod for all of their hostility. All right, last thing, if I can get it to come. All right, finally, and again, just read with me. All active mass movements strive to interpose a fact-proof screen between the faithful and the realities of the world. They do this by claiming that the ultimate and absolute truth is already embodied in their doctrine and that there is no truth nor certitude outside of it. It is the true believer's ability to shut his eyes and stop his ears to facts which is the source of his unequaled fortitude and constancy. He cannot be frightened by danger, nor disheartened by obstacles, nor baffled by contradictions, because he denies their existence. Again, I'm dumbfounded when I read Hoffer with regard to what's happening right now, because a lot of people have said, wow, there's nothing that could come up with regard to facts about Mr. Trump that has in any way undermined his support. In fact, the more egregious the facts, the stronger his support has become. All right, well, you don't need to believe any of this. I think it's interesting, but let's stick to the facts and let's do some experiments. We started this work in August of 2015, right after, a couple of months after, but over a year ago, when Mr. Trump declared his candidacy, we said, wow, this is the same thing psychodynamically as what was going on in 2004 with President Bush. So we did the same studies that we did in 2004, but now with Mr. Trump. All right, so very simple study. In the fall of 2015, we reminded some Americans of death, other Americans of pain, and we asked them, how much do you support Mr. Trump and how likely are you to vote for him? All right, once again, here's the control condition, and here's what happens when we reminded people of their mortality. Once again, when death was on their minds, they liked Mr. Trump a whole lot more. All right, then this summer, when it was obvious that Hillary Clinton was going to be the Democratic challenger, we did the same thing. We remind some people of death, other people of something unpleasant, and then we ask some people to evaluate Mr. Trump, other people to evaluate Mrs. Clinton. All right, and here's what we find. All right, this graph is a little burnt, but on this side is the control condition. The blue bar is Hillary Clinton. The green bar is Mr. Trump. All right, so in control conditions, people liked Hillary Clinton a whole lot more than Mr. Trump. Can you see that on the bars? All right, but here's what happens when we remind them of death. Their opinion of Hillary Clinton does not change, but now they like Mr. Trump a whole lot more. In fact, they like Mr. Trump a little bit more than Mrs. Clinton, but this is not statistically significant. All right, how's that sound so far? I can't remember. Oh, no, got to go back. Wait. Got to go back. Don't look at that yet. All right, so what's the point so far? I would argue that just as in 2004, that people's opinions of a charismatic leader, in this case Donald Trump, are quantitatively and qualitatively different when existential anxieties are aroused. All right, but you might be sitting there saying, well, so what? Trump doesn't, before he starts speaking at his rallies, hand out questionnaires to remind people of their mortality. And he doesn't have his news conferences in front of a funeral parlor. And he doesn't flash the word death on his website so fast that you can't see it. Actually, I don't know. People are saying, I'm just saying, I didn't say that. Other people are saying, one never knows. But what do we know? Well, we know that Trump on the stump, he doesn't know what the nuclear triad is, but he certainly knows the triad of evil, and that is that Trump's entire campaign is based on the idea that terrorists will obliterate us, that Islam is intrinsically dangerous, and that hordes of immigrants will storm Buffalo and steal our chicken wings and rape our women. And the point that I want to make, and this is, now we got to get back to that death thought accessibility idea that we did earlier and that I know you've almost forgotten about. But right after, in 2004, when we asked Americans to think about the events of September 11th, well, that increased death thought accessibility the same as if we asked them to think about death. All right, so thinking about terrorism increases unconscious death thoughts the same amount that thinking about death does. All right, then in 2011, we asked Americans in Staten Island to think about a mosque being built in their neighborhood. Who remembers the Cordoba Mosque, the Ground Zero Mosque? Well, what we found is, once again, just thinking about a mosque being built in your neighborhood made death thought accessibility go up again, just like you've been asked to think about dying. Ditto for immigrants. We did this last summer. We asked people to think about immigrants moving into their neighborhood, and that made death thought accessibility also increase. All right, so what's the point? The point is, I would argue, and I'm arguing this based on this evidence, is that when Mr. Trump in his rallies talks about terrorism, talks about Islam, or talks about immigrants, this plausibly might increase death thought accessibility. And once death thought accessibility is increased, that in turn might increase support for Mr. Trump. And that's my argument about why every time something bad happens, who's aware that Mr. Trump's popularity, at least to date, has gone up anytime there's been something ugly that has happened? All right, well, what's the point? And by the way, I appreciate that you've been paying attention, and because I stopped listening to myself a while ago. But two things, and I think they're important. Point number one is I want to argue that some support for Donald Trump is the result of non-conscious defensive reactions to existential terror. I don't think it has anything to do with a rational consideration of an agreement with Mr. Trump's specific policies or proposals. And I think this is important. We said the same thing in 2004. I'm not saying that everyone who supports Mr. Trump necessarily does so because of death anxiety. On the other hand, the evidence is very clear that under benign psychological conditions, people think more poorly of him than they do when death is on their minds. And the same thing is not true for either Senator Kerry in 2004 or Mrs. Clinton in 2016. The second thing is that I would argue that regardless of your political predilections, that these findings have ominous implications for democracy. And I think there's two things I would urge us to think about collectively. Thing number one is that this is why the Founding Fathers were very nervous about democracy. From middle school social science, who elected U.S. senators back in the early days? Not the people. All right, state legislators. Do you remember this? Do they teach that in school anymore? All right, anyway, the point is that back in the old days, the founding fathers, they were nauseous at the prospect of letting everybody vote because they understood the danger of ideological demagogues appealing to our basest emotions, and they thought the only remedy for that was education. That's why Thomas Jefferson was such a big fan of education and was proud to have started the University of Virginia. All right, thing number two, and at the risk of sounding provocative, but if you have time, besides the Hoffer book, I suggest a book. It's not a great novel, but who knows the Sinclair Lewis book, It Can't Happen Here? Anybody know that book? Very interesting and important book, written in the 1940s. And Sinclair Lewis, great American writer. And it's a book about kind of a bumbling business guy who teams up with the military and fundamentalists, and they win an election and they turn America into a totalitarian state. Right? And right after he wrote that book, people said, wow, when fascism comes to America, it will come wrapped in a flag and holding a cross. And I would just argue the people, Elena, when we were in Denmark, was that 3 or 4 weeks ago? Okay, so we were in Denmark a few weeks ago, and that's all people were talking about. They're like, oh, you know, this is ominous. I was in Germany last week, and that's all the Germans were talking about. I would just urge us not to be complacent and to think that because things have not happened here before, that they can't happen. All right, so although it may be obvious how I actually feel about the election, I really haven't said anything so far except to try and hide behind the data that I've presented. But I do think that, and this is just my opinion, and you should feel free to take issue with it, but Shakespeare fans, I guess you'll remember this is from Macbeth. Remember, Macbeth doth murder sleep. And I just think that one of the things that keeps me up at night is that Trump is, in this sense, a murderer. I don't mean this literally, but he doth murder truth. According to PolitiFact, an alarming 78% of everything that Trump says is either patently false or mostly false. No other candidate in the history of Earth can lie with such an insouciant disregard for the truth. And in fact, I would argue that one of the reasons that Hillary Clinton struggles is because she has a conscience. So when she lies, it's actually obvious. She lies, according to PolitiFact, about 29% of the time. Nothing to be proud of, but by the way, the lowest number of falsehoods of any of the major candidates this time around. I think Trump has done great damage to our already wavering tradition of being civil in public spaces. Hate crimes are up. Little kids in school of color and of Hispanic origin are having PTSD when they're told by their classmates that they're going to get deported and that they're going to get tossed over a big wall. At sporting events, people of color and Hispanic athletes, the white kids chant, build a wall, build a wall. This is not good in my estimation. Trump has done a good job on murdering intelligence. According to George Lakoff, the linguist at Berkeley, if you analyze the language at Trump's rallies and in his speeches, he uses an approximately 4th grade level of verbal discourse. Those of us that were around in 1980 when Ronald Reagan were elected, who remembers Frank Zappa? I know many of you do. But one of my favorite Zappa quotes was when he said, "The American public treats intelligent behavior as if it were some sort of hideous physical deformity." And it's Zappa, but nevertheless, he has a point, and they've made a mockery of intelligence. All right, but here's the thing that I want to leave you with. I have a few more things, but and that is that Trump, given the opportunity, will murder our planet. And frankly, I'm shocked until today when Eugene Robinson wrote a column about this. There's been almost no mention of the fact that Trump is unique in his denial of humanly induced climate change. So this was this Sunday in the LA Times. By Donald Trump's account, scientists have tricked Americans into accepting that global warming is caused by the burning of fossil fuels. Right? And then he said, I'm not a big believer in man-made climate change. So meanwhile, this is a couple of blocks away from where he was speaking. Right? So he's like, I'm not a big believer in climate change. And those are the cars in the neighborhood trying to get through the floods that are undoubtedly the result of humanly induced climate change. Right? Again, at the risk of sounding provocative, the fact that the planet is getting warmer is no, I'm fucking hot right now, but the fact that the planet is warming is no more in doubt than the existence of gravity. Sure, there's uncertainties about when it started, what rate it's happening, and what we ought to do about it, but there's no doubt that it's happening. And in fact, if you write to me or if you Google it, it'll be faster. Look up the Defense Department report on the threat that global climate change poses to national security. All right, so the military, they say that the biggest threat to our security is not terrorism, it's not immigrants, it's not the Chinese taking our jobs. It's global warming, because if we don't do anything about that, there'll be 1 in 6 people on Earth by the end of the century will be climate refugees. There'll be political instability in almost any third and second world country. And it'll make a Shelley Winters disaster film seem like a Walt Disney one by comparison if we don't do something about that. And so my point is, in my opinion, that would be enough. Forgetting about everything else, I would argue that Mr. Trump's position on global warming puts him at odds with the rest of the planet. He has vowed, if elected, to, on the first day of office, renege on our agreements. Just like Ronald Reagan, what did he do on his first day of office to the White House? Took the solar panels out that Jimmy Carter had put in. And this is terrifying, and so is this bumper sticker that I saw, I think in Pennsylvania, Trump digs coal. I changed it a little bit. I said Trump digs death. All right, almost done. All right, so read with me, and let's wrap it up. So now what? And crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. But each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration: the need to maintain balance in and among national programs, balance between the private and the public economy, balance between cost and hoped for advantage. Another factor in maintaining balance involves the element of time. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. Down the long lane of the history yet to be written, America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate, and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect. Some of you I know this. Who said that? Who's the only other guy who ran for president without prior experience? That's right, but he never got there. He did, you're right. All right, give me another guy who won. Not Reagan. Right? So this Dwight Eisenhower, no, Reagan never transcended the monosyllabic utterance, but my point is read that again, at some point, and note the glaring difference. Can you imagine a Republican today talking about we must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate, and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect? The reason I mention this is in part because I think what Eisenhower said is very profound and profoundly important. And to get back to where we started this evening, I think this is a big part of what the Ethical Culture Society is dedicated to, the Ernest Becker Foundation, and the Contemporary Heroism Initiative. Last thing, and then I'll shut up and thank you for coming. Every one of these things that I said, where I made a statement, a declarative statement about the nature of reality, it has been published somewhere. Not that you can see these references, but do feel free to write me. I don't even know if you can see that, but I'm Sheldon Solomon. I work at Skidmore College. I'd be happy to send you all of the publications so you can actually see these studies. And I also look forward to exchanging ideas. If you have a question, write to me. If you disagree with something that I've said, good, write to me. We need more civil disagreement in public discourse. That's what democracy is all about. All right, thank you very much for coming this evening. That's fine with me. Okay, Steve says we have time for some questions.
So, hello. So what is if you were advising Hillary Clinton for, say, the debate on Monday or very soon, what is the antidote to this language? What would you tell her to do to nullify this use?
Yeah, did everyone hear that? Let me amplify because we just got sound towards the end. Good question, sir, and that is, well, what could one do in terms of if you were Hillary Clinton, what could you do? I think she's in a tough spot. You know, when I read the Hoffer things about this idea of a fact-proof screen, I'm not sure that even the most cogent arguments will suffice to influence people who are already devoted to Mr. Trump as a candidate. My argument, what I think is that what might help is broad public dissemination of these studies, not because I had anything to do with them, and it would have to be done in a way that didn't appear to be patronizing and condescending. Because when you say, unconscious death anxiety alters political preferences, it's not meant to imply that this is a phenomenon that is a reflection of a lack of education or intelligence. And so, you know, Freud said, well, one way to disarm a psychological defense is to make it quite conscious and explicit. I know that's not a great answer, and maybe we should keep talking, but I think this highlights why it could get pretty tough. Good question. Sir?
Yes, a follow-up in a way, but one of Hillary's responses has been to emphasize optimism and to say America is already great. Is there anything in your work that would tend to support kind of the opposite? If one stresses life, optimism, good feeling, that one is more likely to support a person who is a leader of the other kinds you mentioned?
Yeah, good question. This is not our work, but there is work in social psychology that suggests that optimism goes a long way to minimize these kinds of existential anxieties. There's also research, some of which that we have done, that shows that when we remind people to be both humble and grateful, that minimizes death anxiety. And so that would be a possible approach, and that's a good point.
I have two questions. One is American democracy is an emergency room, or?
Yes.
And if you agree,
Next question.
yes, obviously. My second question is, how do we get out from this one God and two political party reality?
Don't know, not a political scientist. Did everybody hear the question? I think, so question number one was, is American democracy in the emergency room? And I think a case could be made. I don't think that it's an overstatement. We are, besides that, most of us are just painfully uninformed about how government works, and therefore not in a position to make intelligent and informed decisions in elections. There's also such wholesale dissatisfaction and suspicion of just the idea of government. You know, this old-timers goes back to when Reagan was elected in 1980. Government's done a ton of good things. Did anybody see Ken Burns' graduation speech at Stanford? It's all over the internet. You might take a look at that, where he points out that government's done quite a number of things. And then the second question was just about how will we extricate ourselves from a two-party system that is arguably leaving us with essentially no choice. It's like light beer. It tastes great or less filling, right? Neither. Tastes like yak urine, and if you drink enough of them, you'll need a license plate to be out in public.
Sheldon, thank you for a brilliant talk. All of this makes a lot of sense to me, and I can certainly understand how death anxiety would push people towards these kind of xenophobic, demagogues on the right. But it seems to me that it should also push at least some people further to the left if they already have these entrenched views. So have you kind of taken into account that sort of ideological diversity as well in your studies?
Yes, excellent question. All right, in the two Trump studies that I presented, and great point because I should have said this, we measured political orientation. And while these samples were relatively moderate, we did have across the board, and in both cases, political orientation didn't affect the outcome. But that doesn't address your point, which is who knows if Bernie Sanders had become a candidate, because he has a populist bent of sorts. It would be interesting to have seen what would happen if Sanders was running against Trump and we reminded people of death. Would the Republicans go one way and the Democrats go the other way? Good point, don't know. Yep. Oh, this way, I'm sorry. Thanks, Steve.
You didn't have time to go into the self-esteem aspect of your theory, but Donald Trump certainly seems to have a hypersensitivity to criticism. And I was wondering if you could just speak to that for a moment, how that might factor into everything that's happening, and how that might reflect the individuals also who are attracted.
Wow. Okay, good question. We'll need, I'll repeat the question. The question's about self-esteem, and a lot of our theoretical work is devoted to understanding the importance of self-esteem. And the statement was that Mr. Trump seems to be hypersensitive to criticism, and what implications, if I got the question right, might that have for prevailing discourse? Has anybody seen in The Atlantic a guy named Don McAdams, who's a great psychologist, wrote a psychological profile of Mr. Trump? Has anybody seen that? And he's a very reasoned guy, not like me. He's not a histrionic polemicist. And he said that Mr. Trump, if he was elected president, would be both the most narcissistic as well as the most disagreeable person to ever inhabit the office. And all I would point out is that narcissism and self-esteem are completely different. The narcissistic individual is a legend in his or her own mind, but actually has tremendously low self-esteem. This is a long story, not going to be able to get there tonight, but there's two kinds of self-esteem. There's self-esteem, if I give you a self-esteem scale, that's called explicit self-esteem. And then there's how you feel about yourself, but you don't know. That's called implicit self-esteem. Narcissists have incredibly high explicit self-esteem, but they have really low implicit self-esteem. And so I would argue, along with a lot of other folks, that that's a recipe for very volatile and unstable behavior. And two examples that you're all aware of. Remember when President Obama went to China the other week, and they didn't have the red carpet out, so the poor bastard had to get out on the steps like the rest of us. And Trump said that he would have turned the plane around and flown away. And then there was the Iranian boat that circled our boat, and they gave us some gestures. And Trump said, I will blow those little boats out of the water if anybody gestures at us in that fashion. I'm not sure that completely addresses your concern, but good
Going
point.
in the right direction, because it's terrifying.
All right, good. All right, over here.
You may have just touched on this, but as far as mitigating the priming effect for this mortality salience, right? So we have this big spike in how people support certain people. Did you study how you kind of reduce that effect? You just said maybe to remind them to be humble. Like, how effective is that? Does that kind of bring it back down to a baseline, or is it like, what studies have been done about how we can kind of unprime people?
Yeah, awesome. Did everybody hear that? So that's a great question. The question is, all right, you have these, people think about death, and then they behave in a variety of unsavory ways. What have we done to minimize that or eradicate it? All right, if we boost self-esteem, that reduces it to the point of baseline. Gratitude and humility reduces it to the point of baseline. Secure attachments. Who's lucky enough to be in a long-standing relationship with a significant other? When we remind people in a stable relationship to just think about their significant other, that reduces defensive reactions to a baseline level. The other thing, and this is politically loaded, is that when we remind people that Americans value tolerance and open-mindedness, that also reduces these effects. There's more things, but that's a good compendium. Again, thank you so much, everybody. I hope I'll hear from some of you all. Thank you.